Hello and welcome to the New Indian Express Online. I am with a very special guest, a translator, someone who is an academic but is so good with translation that she has translated so many works into English. We have Professor Krishna Manavalli. Thank you for joining us on the program. My first question to you is, you have translated so many works of great giants into English. So, what is your upcoming work? What is your next project, next big project?
Hi, and it feels so good to be here with you and with you all at the Express. When you are asking me about my upcoming work, there are a couple of them that I'm thinking of at the moment, and there is one which I'm already working on that's work in progress. And one of the things that I am working on already is a translation of Dr. Chandrasekhar Kambar, the Gnanpith Award winner, and perhaps the finest myth maker of our times, and everybody knows him, the stalwart Kannada writer. I am working on translating his narrative poems which tell stories, because as a writer who uses the folk idiom and the folk cultural roots, Kambar is greatly, engaged with bringing in this aspect of storytelling into all of his writing, because that's at the core of the folk imagination. And these poems are long poems which tell stories. I am working on that project now.
Okay, so now when you speak of Kannada, when you look at Kannada imagery, and when you look at English, or the imagery of any one of these European languages like English, German, the imagery is so different. And language is so much about imagery, about perception. So it is almost like a world apart. How do you make them meet? How do you make them connect?
When we talk about language, language is something that is all the time changing. Language is unstable, and to that extent, if you're thinking of stable meanings, it's a fallacy actually. Every act of reading itself is an interpretation, and language as a medium is what makes you see the different perspectives of any text. Textuality and language are those which change with every act of reading. And with translation, it's almost like all the time for me an act of transcreation, and how you work with language, and especially the kind of folk idiom that Dr. Chandrasekhar Kambar uses, for instance. It's not just about meanings, it's also about the musicality, the rhythm of that language, and the element of music and sound which I try to capture in my writing. On the one hand, you can't be literal. So you have different choices, and every translator makes these linguistic choices. And there is also ideological problems involved there. Are you going to give yard-long footnotes and fall into the Orientalist trap, make it exotic? There is something so different from the mainstream cultures that you are trying to be some kind of a native interpreter. It doesn't work that way. On the other hand, if you try to familiarize it too much, imagine using American slang, that doesn't work either. So it's always like a balancing act. It's like a razor's edge, And every time, like I said, it's a matter of choices. What kind of language do you use? And how do you try to transmute some of the essential core elements of the original text into the translated text? That, I think, is something which has to do with a lot of different things, like the translator. There is so much of the translator in the translation too. So the translator, and then the translated text, and then the original text, original author, and the cultural format within which it is translated. So it is always something which is creative, changing. I often use this paradigm of music. For instance, there is this raga. Every time somebody sings the raga or plays the raga, it is not the same, but at the same time, there is something which you identify as the same in the raga, right? And how do you do it? Over a long time, with practice, with a lot of listening, you make the raga your own. When you sing or play it correctly, and at the same time also creatively. I think translation is like that, which is the reason why I think we must soak in the writing of a particular writer. That is when that idiom starts becoming more and more palpable and something that you can negotiate with, something that you can make into your own. That's how I see translation. It's a creative act, so it's not a matter of equivalences or trying to find the quote unquote the authentic meanings at all. I mean, that would be too reductive.
So how much of you is really there in these, these translated texts?
I think quite a lot. I am sure of that. I'm happy about it because when I think about Karimai, for instance, the way I relate to Kambar's writing, the kind of language, the folk idiom that he uses, and the folk cultural roots that he was trying to go back to in the times of high modernism in Canada. He chose a very different path. All this drew me to his writing, and then the centrality of the archetypal mother in most of his writing. That is another thing which I can relate to so wonderfully. There are a whole lot of other things which like for example, the idea of the collective. It's always a kind of the myth is something, as Kambar is very often fond of saying, myth emerges from a collective imagination, and there is myth.
Like for example, Punyakoti.
There are lots of these myths, and myths are something where myth is a place where the time and the space kind of coalesce, right? There is this brilliant example in one of his novels, Shikara Surya, where you see the whole world around, both the animate and inanimate nature, reflected in a lake on the mother's hill. And then there is this protagonist who is playing the flute. And when the music of the flute permeates the whole place, and on that moonlit night, it's like there is a stillness where time and space kind of coalesce, they merge, they fuse, and that is that epiphanic moment, that moment of stillness is where you find that kind of collective identity and that collective being. So probably, some of these things drew me to his writing a lot. And he is somebody who makes myth contemporary, right? So it's not, he says this again many times, that his Shivapura is not this unchanging place which does not respond to what's happening around it. It reflects even the global and the national happenings. So when you look at a writer like Kambar, and when you sort of immerse yourself into his writing, it's these different kinds of insights, it's these different kinds of moments and movements in the text with which you can relate to. Those make me very, very, happy, and these are like the great moments of a translator. Right? You feel those highs and lows, and there are times when you feel that, here is something that I have recreated in my text. And there are moments when you are trying to negotiate with some of the things, the difficult parts. And that again is a challenge.
Which was the most difficult part of it? Your most difficult part in being a translator? Which was the most difficult? The abysmal low, as they call it.
Sometimes trying to translate the poetry, verses. Yeah. And for Kambar, his place in even his prose is so poetic. And so when you're trying to translate the poems, you're always,
there's this shudder, have I got it right?
Yeah, there is always this moment of anxiety. But there is also this exhilaration of doing something challenging. And these are creative moments again. How do you translate that into another language? So that is something that makes me feel good when I have done something that I'm happy with. Or once Dr. Kambar told me, I asked him, what do you think about my translation? And he said, look, I think you're doing a marvelous job. And of all the translators who translated my works, interestingly, my guru, Pandit Rajiv Taranatji, he has translated his very early play, Jokumaraswamy. And that to this day is my model. because you can see how the original and the English text become almost seamless. You know, it's the seamlessness which I try to achieve in my translation, right? Not making into a kind of an Orientalist sort of a text. Anyways, and that apart, I mean, getting back to what Dr. Kambar was saying, he told me that I think what you're doing is wonderful. And I've talked to some of my readers who have read your translations, and they told me that they did not miss Kambar in those texts. Isn't that the highest compliment?
That's the best compliment. Yeah. So thank you for joining us on this program. So there it is, Dr. Professor Krishna Manavalli telling us that translation is, of course, getting two worlds to really seamlessly merge and make them one. Thank you for watching.